There is a warship sitting in Boston Harbor right now at this very moment that was built while George Washington was still alive. She has been afloat for more than 2 centuries. Her hull has tasted salt water in 3 different centuries. She has outlived every sailor who ever served aboard her, every president who ever ordered her to sea, every enemy who ever fired a cannon in her direction. She is the oldest commissioned warship still afloat anywhere on Earth, and her name is Constitution. But what makes her story extraordinary is not simply that she survived. It is what she did when everyone expected her to fail. In the summer of 1812, when the most powerful navy the world had ever seen turned its guns on the young American Republic, this single ship did something that the entire British Royal Navy considered impossible. She won. And then she won again, and again. And the way she did it, the reason those British cannonballs bounced off her sides as if she were made of metal rather than wood, begins not on the ocean, but deep in the coastal swamps of Georgia, with a type of tree so dense, so impossibly hard, that the men who harvested it broke their axes against its grain and sometimes died in the effort to bring it down. The story of the USS Constitution is the story of a nation that had no business building a warship at all, a country so young and so broke and so divided over whether it even wanted a navy that the very idea of challenging Britain at sea seemed like a fantasy. And yet a small group of men, a naval architect who understood something about ship design that no one in Europe had figured out, High President who saw the future more clearly than his critics, and a crew of sailors who had nothing to lose and everything to prove, created a vessel that rewrote the rules of naval warfare and humiliated the greatest maritime empire in human history. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the beginning, to a moment when the United States of America did not have a single warship to its name, and the oceans of the world were controlled entirely by nations that looked at the new republic and saw nothing worth fearing. When the American Revolution ended in 1783, the Continental Navy was disbanded almost immediately. The young nation was drowning in war debt, and maintaining a fleet of warships seemed like an extravagance that a fragile republic could not afford. The last warship of the Revolution, the frigate Alliance, was sold off in 1785, and just like that, America became a country with thousands of miles of coastline and not a single armed vessel to defend it. For most of the political leaders of the time, this was not a problem, it was a principle. The prevailing philosophy, championed most forcefully by Thomas Jefferson and his allies, held that standing armies and permanent navies were the tools of monarchs and tyrants. A republic, they argued, should rely on citizen militias and coastal fortifications, not expensive fleets that would only tempt the government into foreign wars and imperial ambitions. This was not an unreasonable position. The great navies of Europe had indeed been instruments of empire, and the young United States wanted desperately to be something different from the old powers it had just fought to escape. But there was a problem with this philosophy, and it was sailing under the flags of North Africa. The Barbary states, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, had been raiding European shipping in the Mediterranean for centuries. Their corsairs seized merchant vessels, stole their cargoes, and enslaved their crews, holding them for ransom or forcing them into brutal labor. While the American colonies had been part of the British Empire, their merchant ships had sailed under the protection of the Royal Navy. The moment independence was won, that protection vanished. American merchant ships in the Mediterranean became easy prey, and the Barbary corsairs began seizing them with impunity. By the early 1790s, more than 100 American sailors were being held captive in Algiers alone, chained in conditions that horrified the American public when reports filtered back home. The United States tried diplomacy. It tried paying tribute, essentially protection money, to the Barbary rulers. It spent enormous sums, at one point devoting nearly a sixth of the entire federal budget to payments that brought temporary safety, but no lasting solution. Every year brought new seizures, new captives, new demands for more money. The humiliation was total and ongoing, and it forced even the most committed opponents of naval power to confront an uncomfortable truth. A nation without a navy was a nation that could not protect its own citizens. In 1794, Congress passed the Naval Act, authorizing the construction of 6 frigates. The debate had been ferocious. Opponents warned that building warships would bankrupt the treasury, provoke the European powers, and set the Republic on a path toward the very militarism it had been founded to reject. Supporters argued that the cost of not having a navy, in ransoms paid, in commerce lost, in national dignity surrendered, was already higher than the cost of building one. The vote was close, and it came with a compromise that revealed just how nervous Congress was about the whole enterprise. If peace was reached with Algiers before the ships were finished, construction would stop immediately. The nation was so ambivalent about its own navy that it built a self-destruct clause into the authorization. But the ships would be built, at least for now, and the man chosen to design them would make decisions that would echo across the next 2 centuries of naval history. Joshua Humphreys was a Philadelphia shipbuilder, a Quaker who had been constructing vessels since before the Revolution and who understood the realities of American naval power with a clarity that bordered on ruthlessness. He knew that the United States could never match the Royal Navy ship for ship. Britain had hundreds of warships, including massive ships of the line carrying 70, 90, even 100 guns. The American Navy, if it was ever built at all, would have a handful of frigates at best. A frigate was a medium-sized warship, typically carrying between 28 and 44 guns, designed for speed and independent operations rather than the grinding broadsides of fleet battles. In every navy in the world, frigates were subordinate to ships of the line. They were scouts, commerce raiders, convoy escorts, fast but vulnerable, never intended to stand and fight against a heavier opponent. Humphreys looked at this situation and made a decision that was either brilliant or insane, depending on who you asked. He would design frigates that broke every convention of their class. They would be longer, wider, and more heavily armed than any frigate afloat. They would carry the firepower of a small ship of the line, on a hull fast enough to escape from anything they could not defeat. They would be, in the language of their designer, ships that could outfight anything they could not outrun, and outrun anything they could not outfight. This was not a small ambition. It required rethinking nearly every aspect of frigate design. A conventional frigate of the 1790s was built to be light and fast, with a relatively shallow draft and a hull optimized for speed at the expense of strength. Humphreys wanted strength and speed simultaneously, which meant building a larger hull. Constitution would be over 200 feet long and more than 43 feet wide, enormous for a frigate, and arming it with weapons that no frigate had ever carried. The standard armament for a heavy frigate of the era was 28 or perhaps 32 guns, usually 18-pounders. Humphreys specified that Constitution would carry 30 24-pounder long guns on her main deck, with additional carronades and smaller weapons, bringing her total armament to over 50 guns. A 24-pounder fired a cannonball that weighed 24 pounds, 6 pounds heavier than the standard frigate gun. That difference might sound modest, but in naval gunnery, it was transformative. The heavier ball carried more energy at longer range, hit harder on impact, and was far more destructive to an enemy hull. Constitution would be able to punch through the sides of any frigate in the world at distances where her opponent's lighter guns could barely reach her. But firepower meant nothing if the ship was too slow to choose her battles. A heavy, overgunned frigate that could be caught by a ship of the line was simply a target. Humphreys addressed this with a hull form that was revolutionary for its time. Long and relatively narrow, with a sharp entry at the bow and clean lines that would let her move through the water with less resistance than her size would suggest. He also specified a sail plan that was enormous by frigate standards, with towering masts and a vast spread of canvas that could drive her at speeds competitive with the fastest ships afloat. The result was a design that should not have worked according to the conventional wisdom of the era. She was too big to be fast, too fast to be strong, too strong to be maneuverable. And yet, when she finally took to the water, she would prove to be all of those things at once, a floating contradiction that baffled the naval architects of Europe and terrified the captains who had to face her. The construction of Constitution began at Edmund Hart's shipyard in Boston in 1794, and it was an undertaking that tested the resources and ingenuity of the young nation in ways that no one had anticipated. The single most important decision Humphreys made about the ship's construction had nothing to do with her guns or her sail plan. It was about wood. Specifically, it was about a species of oak that grew only in the coastal regions of the American South, from Virginia down through the Carolinas, Georgia, and into the Gulf states. Live oak, Quercus virginiana, was unlike any timber that European shipbuilders used. Where the white oak and English oak that built the navies of Britain and France were hard and durable, live oak was something else entirely. Its wood was so dense that a freshly cut piece would barely float. Its grain was twisted and interlocking in a way that made it extraordinarily resistant to splitting. When dried and seasoned, it became almost supernaturally hard, capable of turning aside tools, and, as the world would later discover, cannonballs, with a stubbornness that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Humphreys had worked with live oak before and knew its qualities intimately. He specified that the entire frame of Constitution, the ribs and structural skeleton that gave the ship her shape and strength, would be built from live oak. It was a decision that would make her the toughest warship afloat, but it came at an enormous cost in human suffering. Harvesting live oak was nightmarish work. The trees grew in the coastal lowlands and sea islands of Georgia and the Carolinas, in landscapes that were part swamp, part jungle, choked with undergrowth and infested with mosquitoes that carried malaria and yellow fever. The trees themselves were massive, some with trunks 4 or 5 feet in diameter, and their wood was so hard that conventional saws and axes dulled and broke against it with maddening speed. Cutting teams had to work in brutal heat and humidity, wading through standing water, fighting insects and snakes, replacing their tools constantly as the wood destroyed them. The timber then had to be dragged out of the swamp, transported to the nearest waterway, and shipped north to Boston. A logistical challenge that added months and enormous expense to the construction process. Workers fell ill in horrifying numbers. Some died. The live oak for Constitution came primarily from St. Simon's Island, off the coast of Georgia, where federal timber reserves had been established, and the human cost of extracting it was one of the hidden sacrifices that made the ship possible. But the result was worth every broken axe blade and every fever-racked worker, because when those massive live oak frames were assembled in Boston and planked over with white oak and red cedar, they created a hull of almost unbelievable toughness, a wooden wall that would prove in the most dramatic possible way that it could do what no wooden ship was supposed to do. The construction process itself was a remarkable achievement for a nation that had never built warships on this scale. Every component had to be sourced, manufactured, and assembled by American craftsmen, and the process stretched over 3 years as funding shortfalls and political uncertainties repeatedly threatened to halt work entirely. The Naval Act's Compromise Clause nearly killed the project in 1796 when a treaty was signed with Algiers, triggering the provision that would have stopped construction. President Washington personally intervened, persuading Congress to authorize the completion of 3 of the 6 frigates, Constitution, United States, and Constellation, while the other 3 were suspended. It was a near-death experience for the American Navy before it even existed, and it underscored just how fragile the political support for naval power remained in the young republic. But work continued in Boston, and as the ship took shape on the ways at Hart's shipyard, one more crucial element was added that would complete her transformation from an ambitious design into an invulnerable fighting machine. Paul Revere, the same Paul Revere whose midnight ride had become a symbol of the Revolution, was by the 1790s a successful industrialist who operated a copper rolling mill in Canton, Massachusetts. Revere's mill produced the copper bolts, spikes, and fittings that held Constitution's hull together. And more importantly, it produced the copper sheathing that covered her bottom below the waterline. Copper sheathing was a relatively recent innovation in naval architecture. Wooden ships that spent months or years in warm waters were constantly attacked by shipworms, burrowing mollusks that ate through planking with devastating efficiency, and by barnacles and marine growth that accumulated on the hull and dramatically slowed the ship. Copper sheathing solved both problems. The copper was toxic to marine organisms, preventing worm damage and keeping the hull clean and smooth. A copper-sheathed ship was faster, lasted longer, and required less time in dry dock for hull maintenance. The copper that Revere's mill produced for Constitution was among the first rolled copper manufactured in America And it represented yet another way in which this single ship pushed the boundaries of what the young nation could achieve. Constitution was launched on October 21st, 1797, and even the launch itself was a drama. The ship was so heavy, over 1,500 tons fully loaded, that on the first attempt, she moved only 27 feet down the slipway before grinding to a halt. The ways had to be redesigned and rebuilt, and a second attempt 2 days later moved her only 31 feet further. It took a third attempt on the 21st to finally send her into the waters of Boston Harbor, where she floated perfectly on her designed waterline, proof that Humphrey's calculations, however ambitious, had been correct. She was the largest frigate in the world, and from the moment she touched salt water, she was something that no navy had ever seen before. A warship that belonged to no existing category, too powerful to be a frigate and too fast to be a ship of the line, occupying a space between the established classes that would give her a decisive advantage in every engagement she would ever fight. Her early years of service were spent in the undeclared naval conflict known as the Quasi-War with France, which lasted from 1798 to 1800. Revolutionary France, angered by America's refusal to honor its wartime alliance and by the Jay Treaty with Britain, had begun seizing American merchant vessels in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Constitution, under the command of Captain Samuel Nicholson, was dispatched to patrol the waters of the West Indies, escorting American merchant convoys and hunting French privateers. The Quasi-War was a limited conflict. Congress never issued a formal declaration of war, and Constitution's service during this period was competent but not spectacular. She captured several small vessels and recaptured a number of American merchant ships that had been seized by the French, but she never fought the kind of full-scale frigate engagement that would have tested her true capabilities. What the Quasi-War did accomplish was to give the young American Navy its first operational experience, to train the officers and sailors who would form the core of the service for the next 2 decades, and to prove that the United States could maintain a professional naval force in active operations far from home waters. Constitution performed well, and the confidence she built during these years would prove essential when the real test came. That test arrived not from France, but from the shores of North Africa. The Barbary corsairs, emboldened by the inconsistency of American payments and the perceived weakness of the young republic, had resumed their attacks on American shipping. In 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli declared war on the United States by the symbolic act of having his soldiers chop down the flagpole in front of the American consulate. President Jefferson, the same Jefferson who had long opposed the very existence of a navy, had no choice but to respond. He dispatched a naval squadron to the Mediterranean, and Constitution, now under the command of Captain Edward Preble, became the flagship of the American force. The first Barbary War that followed was a formative experience for the ship and for the Navy as a whole. Preble was a demanding and aggressive commander who transformed the Mediterranean squadron into a disciplined fighting force. Under his leadership, Constitution bombarded the harbor defenses of Tripoli multiple times, supported landing operations, and projected American power into waters where the young nation had previously been nothing more than a victim. The war also produced one of the most celebrated episodes in early American naval history: the burning of the captured frigate Philadelphia in Tripoli harbor by a raiding party under Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, an act so audacious that even Britain's Lord Nelson reportedly called it the most daring act of the age. Constitution's service in the Barbary Wars established her as the premier warship of the American Navy, and forged the traditions and fighting spirit that would define the service for generations. But the engagements in the Mediterranean, dramatic as they were, had been against an enemy with limited naval capabilities. The corsair vessels were small, lightly armed, and not designed for stand-up fights against a purpose-built warship. What Constitution had not yet done, what no American warship had ever done, was fight and defeat a ship of the Royal Navy. The very idea seemed absurd. Britain's Navy was not merely the largest in the world, it was the largest military organization of any kind that had ever existed. In 1812, the Royal Navy had over 600 warships in commission, manned by more than 140,000 sailors and Marines. The American Navy had fewer than 20 vessels, most of them small. The disparity was so overwhelming that when war finally broke out between the United States and Britain in June of 1812, most informed observers on both sides of the Atlantic assumed that the American Navy would be swept from the seas within weeks. The War of 1812 is often poorly understood, reduced in popular memory to a handful of famous episodes: the burning of Washington, the Battle of New Orleans, the writing of the national anthem, while the naval war that preceded and accompanied these events is largely forgotten. This is a tragedy because what happened at sea during the first year of the war was one of the most astonishing upsets in military history, and Constitution was at the center of it. To understand why her victories mattered so much, you have to understand what the Royal Navy meant in 1812. This was not simply a large fleet. This was the force that had defeated Napoleon's navy at Trafalgar, that had blockaded the entire coast of Europe, that had maintained British control of the world's oceans for more than a century. The Royal Navy was the foundation of the British Empire, the instrument through which a small island nation had become the dominant power on Earth. Its officers were professional, experienced, and supremely confident. Its sailors were the most seasoned in the world, many of them having spent years in continuous combat during the Napoleonic Wars. The idea that an American frigate, from a navy that barely existed, crewed by sailors who had never fought a major fleet action, could defeat a British warship in single combat was considered laughable by virtually everyone in the British naval establishment. They were about to stop laughing. Constitution's first encounter with the Royal Navy in the War of 1812 was not a battle but an escape, and it was every bit as remarkable as the victories that would follow. On July 17, 1812, barely a month after war was declared, Constitution, now under the command of Captain Isaac Hull, found herself becalmed off the coast of New Jersey, surrounded by a British squadron of 5 warships. The squadron included a ship of the line and 4 frigates, any one of which would have been a dangerous opponent. Together, they represented overwhelming force, and in the light airs and flat calm that prevailed, Constitution could not simply spread her canvas and sail away. What followed was one of the most extraordinary chases in naval history, lasting nearly 3 days. Hull and his crew used every trick of seamanship they possessed to keep ahead of the British. They deployed the ship's boats to tow the massive frigate through the calm water, hundreds of men rowing in relays to drag 1,500 tons of warship forward at a crawling pace. They kedged, dropping an anchor far ahead of the ship in the ship's boats, then winching the ship forward to the anchor, hauling it up and repeating the process over and over again. They wet the sails to catch every whisper of breeze, pumped fresh water over the side to lighten the ship, and at one point dragged Constitution out of danger by finding a favorable current that the British squadron had missed. For nearly 60 hours the chase continued, the British ships sometimes closing to within cannon range before falling back as Constitution's crew found some new advantage. It was a virtuoso performance of seamanship, a demonstration that the American Navy, whatever it lacked in numbers, did not lack in skill or determination. When a breeze finally filled in and Constitution pulled away from her pursuers, vanishing over the horizon under a press of sail that made the watching British officers shake their heads in disbelief, the message was clear. This was not going to be the easy naval war that London had expected. The ship was faster than she had any right to be, her crew was better trained than anyone had assumed, and her captain was a man who would not give up under any circumstances. The chase made headlines on both sides of the Atlantic, and while it was technically a retreat rather than a victory, it established Constitution's reputation as a ship that could not be caught and set the stage for what came next. Less than a month later, on August 19, 1812, Constitution encountered the British frigate HMS Guerriere in the waters of the North Atlantic, roughly 400 miles southeast of Halifax. Guerriere was a 38-gun frigate, a captured French vessel that had been serving in the Royal Navy since 1806. She was commanded by Captain James Dacres, a capable and experienced officer who was so confident of victory that he had reportedly hung a sign from his rigging inviting any American frigate to come alongside and fight. Dacres had reason for his confidence. The Royal Navy had not lost a single ship frigate action in living memory. British gunnery was considered the finest in the world. British crews were trained to fight in conditions that would have paralyzed lesser navies. The expectation was total and universal. Guerriere would defeat the American frigate, capture or destroy her, and that would be that. What happened instead became the single most famous naval engagement in American history and one of the most shocking upsets in the long chronicle of warfare at sea. The two ships sighted each other in the late afternoon, and for nearly an hour they maneuvered for position, each captain trying to gain the advantage of the wind. Guerriere opened fire first, at long range, her 18-pound cannonballs arcing across the water toward Constitution's hull. And then something happened that no one on either ship had ever seen before. The cannonballs hit Constitution's side and bounced off. They struck the thick planking of live oak and were deflected, tumbling away into the sea as if the ship's hull were made not of wood, but of iron. A sailor aboard Constitution, the story has been told so many times that the exact words vary, but the meaning is always the same, watched the British shot glance off the hull and shouted, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron!" The nickname stuck instantly and permanently. From that moment forward, she was Old Ironsides, and the legend was born. The science behind what happened is straightforward but remarkable. Constitution's hull was constructed with live oak frames that were thicker and denser than any frigate in any navy. The frames were spaced close together. In some sections, the gaps between them were barely the width of a hand, and the hull planking was layered over them in a construction that created a composite wall of wood more than 21 inches thick at the waterline. Live oak, with its interlocking grain and extraordinary density, did not splinter and shatter the way that the white oak and fir used in British frigates did. Instead, it absorbed the energy of incoming cannonballs and stopped them cold, or deflected them at an angle that sent them skipping away without penetrating. At long range, where the velocity of the incoming shot was reduced by air resistance and distance, Guerriere's 18-pounders simply could not generate enough energy to punch through Constitution's live oak hull. The ship was not literally made of iron, but at the ranges and calibers involved, she might as well have been. Captain Hull, knowing his ship's advantages, closed the distance rapidly. He held his fire as Constitution bore down on Guerriere, waiting until the two ships were so close that the rigging nearly touched, a range of less than 50 yards, point blank by the standards of the era. Only then did he give the order to fire, and Constitution's broadside was devastating. Her 24-pound cannonballs smashed into Guerriere's thinner hull with catastrophic effect, tearing through the planking and sending lethal showers of splinters across the British gun decks. Within 15 minutes, Guerriere's mizzenmast, the rearmost of her three masts, had been shot away, crashing over the side and dragging in the water like a sea anchor, pulling the ship around and making her nearly impossible to steer. Hull continued to pour fire into the crippled British frigate, his gun crews working with a speed and discipline that amazed even the British sailors who witnessed it. Within 30 minutes, Guerriere had lost all three masts. She was a dismasted wreck, rolling helplessly in the Atlantic swell. Her guns silenced, her hull punctured in dozens of places, water pouring in below the waterline. Captain Dacres, wounded and bleeding, had no choice but to surrender. When the smoke cleared and the damage was assessed, the scale of the mismatch became starkly apparent. Guerriere had been hit by roughly 300 shot during the engagement. Her hull was shattered, her rigging was gone, and she was taking on water so fast that she could not be saved even as a prize. Hull's crew attempted to tow her back to port, but she was too badly damaged. And the next day she was set on fire and abandoned, sinking beneath the Atlantic in a column of black smoke. Constitution, by contrast, had suffered remarkably light damage. Her hull had been struck multiple times, but the live oak had done its work. Most of the British shot had failed to penetrate. She had lost no masts, no major structural elements, and suffered only 7 killed and 7 wounded out of a crew of over 450. The disparity was almost unbelievable, and when news of the victory reached the American public, the reaction was explosive. To understand why the defeat of a single British frigate caused such a sensation, you have to remember the context. In the summer of 1812, the war on land was going catastrophically for the United States. An invasion of Canada had ended in humiliation when General William Hull, ironically, the uncle of Constitution's captain, had surrendered the entire garrison of Detroit without firing a shot. American forces along the northern border were being defeated or pushed back at every point. The national mood was one of deepening gloom and anxiety, with many Americans questioning whether the war had been a terrible mistake. Into this atmosphere of defeat and despair came the news that an American warship had not merely fought a British frigate, but had annihilated her in less than 30 minutes. The psychological impact was transformative. Newspapers across the country erupted with celebrations. Congress voted Captain Hull a gold medal. The name Old Ironsides spread across the nation like wildfire, becoming an instant symbol of American resilience and defiance. For the first time since the Revolution, Americans had beaten the British at something that mattered, and they had done it in the arena where British supremacy was supposed to be absolute and unchallengeable. In London, the reaction was the opposite: shock, disbelief, and fury. The Admiralty had expected its frigates to sweep the American Navy from the seas, and instead one of them had been destroyed so thoroughly that it could not even be brought home as evidence. The Times of London, the voice of the British establishment, refused to accept the result, insisting that Constitution must be a disguised ship of the line, a 74-gun battleship pretending to be a frigate. The idea that an American frigate had beaten a British one in a fair fight was simply unacceptable. But the evidence was undeniable, and worse was coming. Over the following months, other American frigates would defeat other British warships in single-ship actions. USS United States would capture HMS Macedonian in October, and USS Constitution herself would strike again before the year was out, creating a pattern of American naval victories that shook British confidence to its foundations and forced a fundamental reassessment of both American capabilities and Royal Navy assumptions. Constitution's second great victory of the War of 1812 came on December 29, 1812, off the coast of Brazil. She was now under the command of Captain William Bainbridge, who had replaced Isaac Hull. Hull had left the ship voluntarily, seeking a shore command after his triumph over Guerriere, and Bainbridge, a seasoned officer with a complicated history that included being captured by the Barbary Corsairs years earlier, was determined to prove himself. His opponent was HMS Java, a 38-gun frigate commanded by Captain Henry Lambert. Java was a newer and faster ship than Guerriere had been, and Lambert was a respected officer who had been warned about Constitution's unusual strength and armament. He knew he was facing a dangerous opponent, but he was a Royal Navy captain, and Royal Navy captains did not avoid battle with frigates. The engagement between Constitution and Java was longer and harder than the fight with Guerriere. It lasted nearly 3 hours and was fought at close range, with both ships maneuvering aggressively and pouring broadsides into each other at distances where every shot told. Java fought with extraordinary courage. Her crew maintained their guns even as their ship was being systematically dismantled around them. Lambert himself was mortally wounded during the battle, a musket ball striking him down on his own quarterdeck, but command passed smoothly to his first lieutenant and the ship fought on. Constitution was not unscathed this time. Her rigging was badly damaged. Her wheel was shot away at one point, forcing Bainbridge to steer with the tiller from below decks, and Bainbridge himself was wounded twice during the engagement, a musket ball striking his thigh and a copper bolt driving into his hip. He refused to leave the quarterdeck and continued to direct the battle through the pain. But Constitution's fundamental advantages, her heavier guns, her stronger hull, her tougher construction, told in the end. Java lost her foremast, then her mainmast, then her bowsprit, until she was a floating wreck, unable to maneuver or fight. Like Guerriere before her, she was too badly damaged to be saved as a prize. Bainbridge ordered her stripped of anything useful and then set ablaze, and she burned and sank in the South Atlantic, the second British frigate destroyed by Old Ironsides in less than 5 months. The victory was not as clean or as one-sided as the fight with Guerriere, but it was in some ways even more impressive because Java had been a better ship, her crew had fought harder, and Bainbridge had won despite being wounded and despite taking significant damage to his own vessel. It proved that Constitution's triumph over Guerriere had not been a fluke. The ship was genuinely superior to anything the Royal Navy could send against her in her class, and the implications of that fact rippled through every naval establishment in the world. The British response to these defeats was dramatic and revealing. The Admiralty issued an order that no British frigate was to engage an American 44-gun frigate in single combat. This was an almost unprecedented admission of inferiority from a navy that prided itself on its willingness to fight anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. The order was not widely publicized. It would have been deeply embarrassing, but it was real, and it reflected a genuine reassessment of the threat that Constitution and her sister ships posed. The British also began building their own heavy frigates, designed specifically to counter the American super frigates, and they tightened their blockade of American ports to try to keep Constitution and other American warships bottled up where they could not do any more damage. The era of easy British dominance at sea was over, at least in frigate actions, and Constitution was the ship that had ended it. Constitution's final major engagement of the War of 1812 came on February 20th, 1815, when she encountered and captured two British warships simultaneously, HMS Cyane, a 34-gun frigate, and HMS Levant, a 21-gun corvette. The battle took place off the coast of West Africa, near the Cape Verde Islands, and it was a masterpiece of tactical skill by Constitution's captain Charles Stewart. Facing two opponents who together mounted more guns than his own ship, Stewart used superior seamanship and the precise handling of his vessel to engage them sequentially rather than simultaneously, concentrating his fire on one while keeping the other at a disadvantage. Cyane was forced to surrender first, followed by Levant, and both were taken as prizes. It was a fitting final act for Constitution's combat career, a victory won not just by the ship's inherent superiority, but by the skill and daring of the men who sailed her. The engagement took place after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed in December 1814, ending the war, but word had not yet reached the ships at sea, a common occurrence in an age when news traveled no faster than the wind could carry it. When the war ended, Constitution had compiled a combat record that was without parallel in American naval history, and that stood comparison with anything achieved by any frigate in any navy. She had fought and won 4 major engagements, destroyed or captured 3 British warships, escaped from an entire British squadron through 3 days of inspired seamanship, and suffered remarkably few casualties throughout. She had earned a nickname that became one of the most famous in military history, and had transformed the reputation of the American Navy from a joke into a force that commanded respect. But beyond the statistics and the glory, Constitution had done something even more important. She had proven that the design philosophy of Joshua Humphreys worked. The concept of a ship that could outgun what she could not outrun, and outrun what she could not outgun, was not just a theory. It had been tested in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable, actual combat against the best navy in the world, and it had been vindicated completely. The years after the War of 1812 brought both glory and danger for Constitution. She continued to serve in the United States Navy, undertaking Mediterranean cruises, showing the flag in ports around the world, and serving as a symbol of American naval power during a period when the nation was rapidly expanding and asserting its place on the world stage. But time was not kind to wooden warships. The relentless assault of water, weather, marine organisms, and simple age took their toll on even the toughest hull, and by the late 1820s, Constitution was in poor condition. She was old by the standards of the era. Wooden warships rarely lasted more than 20 years in active service, and there were serious proposals to break her up for scrap. The Navy had newer ships, the war was long over, and maintaining a decaying relic seemed like an unnecessary expense. Constitution had served her purpose, the argument went, and it was time to let her go. What saved her was a poem. In 1830, a young law student named Oliver Wendell Holmes, who would later become one of America's most famous writers, read a newspaper report that Constitution was scheduled to be scrapped. Outraged, he wrote a poem called Old Ironsides that was published in the Boston Daily Advertiser and rapidly reprinted in newspapers across the country. The poem was a passionate plea to save the ship, invoking her battle honors and her place in the national memory, and it struck a nerve with the American public in a way that no policy argument or preservation campaign ever could have. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Citizens wrote letters, signed petitions, and demanded that Congress save the ship. The Navy, caught off guard by the intensity of public feeling, reversed course and ordered Constitution restored rather than scrapped. It was one of the earliest and most successful historic preservation campaigns in American history, and it established a precedent that would save the ship again and again over the coming decades whenever the question of her fate arose. Holmes had understood something that the naval bureaucrats had missed. Constitution was not just a ship. She was a symbol, a piece of the national soul, and destroying her would have been an act of self-inflicted amnesia that the country was not willing to commit. The restoration of the 1830s was the first of many. Constitution would be rebuilt, repaired, and restored repeatedly over the following 2 centuries, each time raising the same questions about how much of the original ship remained and whether it was worth the enormous expense of maintaining a vessel that had long since ceased to have any military utility. The answer, every time, was yes. The ship's symbolic value transcended any practical calculation. She represented something about the American character, the willingness to fight against overwhelming odds, the refusal to accept that the established order could not be challenged, the belief that ingenuity and determination could overcome raw power that resonated across generations and across the political divisions that otherwise tore the country apart. During the Civil War, Constitution was moved to the Naval Academy in Newport, Rhode Island, to keep her safe from Confederate raiders. She served as a training ship for decades, introducing generations of young officers to the traditions of the service and to the living history that her timbers embodied. The story of Constitution's physical survival is itself a remarkable narrative of craftsmanship, dedication, and evolving attitudes toward historic preservation. Over the centuries, virtually every plank, every timber, every piece of rigging has been replaced at least once, raising the philosophical question of whether the ship that sits in Boston Harbor today is really the same vessel that fought Guerriere in 1812. It is a version of an ancient philosophical puzzle. If every part of an object is replaced over time, is it still the same object? For the Navy and for the millions of visitors who walk her decks every year, the answer is unambiguous. Constitution is not merely a collection of physical materials. She is a continuous identity, a living tradition maintained in an unbroken line from the day she was launched in 1797 to the present moment. The ship has been in continuous commission in the United States Navy since that day, over 200 years without a break, making her the oldest commissioned warship still afloat anywhere in the world. The British Navy's HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, is older, but she sits in a permanent dry dock in Portsmouth and has not been afloat since 1922. Constitution still floats. She still sails. She is still manned by active duty sailors of the United States Navy, and she still carries the full weight of her commission and her history on her ancient timbers. The ship's most recent major restoration, completed in 2017, was a multi-year project that cost tens of millions of dollars and involved replacing or repairing much of her hull below the waterline. Modern naval architects and shipwrights use traditional methods wherever possible, handcrafting replacement timbers, using techniques that would have been familiar to the workers at Hart's shipyard in the 1790s. They also used modern technology, laser scanning, computer modeling, advanced materials analysis, to understand the ship's structure and condition in ways that Joshua Humphreys could never have imagined. The result is a vessel that is seaworthy and sound, capable of sailing under her own power, as she does on her annual turnaround cruise in Boston Harbor every 4th of July, when she is towed out and then sails briefly under her own canvas, firing her guns in salute, a moment that connects the present directly to the distant past in a way that no museum exhibit or documentary film ever could. What makes Constitution's story resonate so powerfully across the centuries is not just the drama of her battles or the ingenuity of her design. It is the deeper truth that she embodies about how the world changes. When she was built, the United States was a fragile experiment, a country that most of the world's established powers expected to fail. It had no military tradition, no industrial base, no standing in the councils of nations. It was a former colony that had won its independence through a combination of French help and British exhaustion. and few observers gave it much chance of surviving as an independent nation, let alone becoming a power that could challenge the empires of Europe. Constitution was built in that context, a single ship designed by a man who understood that his country could not play by the rules of the established order and win. Humphreys did not try to build a conventional frigate. He built something new, something that broke the categories, something that forced the most powerful navy in the world to change its own rules in response. That act of creative defiance, of looking at an impossible situation and finding an answer that no one else had considered, is the essence of the Constitution story, and it is the reason the ship still matters today. Think about what it took. A nation with no navy, no naval tradition, no shipbuilding infrastructure to speak of, decides to build warships. Not just any warships, but warships that are deliberately designed to be better than anything the greatest naval power in history can put on the water. The wood comes from swamps where men die of fever cutting it down. The copper comes from a factory owned by a Revolutionary War hero who had to teach himself metallurgy. The design comes from a Quaker shipbuilder who has never seen a fleet action, but who understands the physics of naval warfare better than the admirals of Britain. And when the ship is finally built, launched and sent to sea, she does exactly what her designer said she would do. She fights the best the British have to offer, and she wins, not once but repeatedly, not by luck, but by the systematic application of superior design, superior materials, and superior seamanship. It is the story of what happens when intelligence and determination are applied to an impossible problem, and it is a story that has never lost its power to inspire. The live oak that made Constitution's hull so impervious to British cannonballs tells its own story about the relationship between a nation and its land. Live oak grows slowly. A tree large enough to provide structural timbers for a warship might be 200 years old or more. The trees that built Constitution had been growing since the early 1600s, since before the English colonies in North America even existed. They had stood in the Georgia swamps while the colonial era played out around them, while wars were fought and governments rose and fell, and they were cut down and shaped into the skeleton of a warship at the exact moment when the young nation needed them most. There is something almost too perfect about this, the land itself providing the materials for the nation's defense, as if the continent had been preparing for the moment when it would need to produce something harder and tougher than anything the old world could throw at it. It is the kind of coincidence that history offers up occasionally, a convergence of natural resource and human need that seems designed to teach a lesson about readiness and potential. The men who sailed Constitution are worth remembering as well, though the focus of this story has been on the ship herself and the forces that created her. The sailors of the early American Navy were a diverse and often surprising group. Many were experienced merchant seamen who had sailed the world's oceans in commercial vessels before the war. Some were free black men. The early American Navy, unlike the Army, accepted black sailors from its inception, and they served alongside white sailors in roles that ranged from ordinary seamen to skilled positions like cook and carpenter. The exact number of black sailors aboard Constitution during the War of 1812 is debated, but contemporary records and muster rolls indicate that they were a significant presence, perhaps 10 to 15% of the crew. They fought in every engagement, they handled the guns and the rigging, and they shared in the glory and the danger equally. It is a piece of American history that complicates simple narratives about the nation's past, a reminder that the reality was always more complex and more interesting than the stories we tell about it. The officers who commanded Constitution during her years of glory were remarkable men in their own right, each shaped by the unique circumstances of serving in a navy that was fighting for its very existence. Isaac Hull, the captain who defeated Guerriere, was a stocky, energetic Connecticut man who had been at sea since the age of 14, and who combined technical skill with an aggressive instinct that made him a natural fighter. William Bainbridge, who defeated Java, was a more complicated figure. He had been captured twice earlier in his career, once by the French and once by the Barbary corsairs, and he carried the weight of those humiliations into every subsequent command, fighting with a desperate intensity that came from having something to prove. Charles Stewart, who captured Cyane and Levant, was perhaps the most naturally talented of the three. A Philadelphia-born officer whose handling of Constitution in that double engagement, fighting two ships simultaneously and defeating both, is still studied in naval academies as an example of tactical brilliance under pressure. These men were not products of a centuries-old naval tradition like their British counterparts. They had learned their trade in the rough school of the merchant service and the limited conflicts of the Quasi-War and the Barbary Wars, and they brought to their commands a pragmatism and an adaptability that the more rigidly trained Royal Navy officers sometimes lacked. The impact of Constitution's victories extended far beyond the immediate military results. In strategic terms, the frigate actions of 1812 had limited effect on the overall course of the war. Britain's naval superiority was so vast that the loss of a few frigates, however embarrassing, did not materially affect the balance of power. The Royal Navy's blockade of the American coast tightened steadily as the war progressed, and by 1814, American ports were effectively sealed, with Constitution and other American warships trapped in harbor for months at a time. The war on land seesawed back and forth, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage, and it ended in a negotiated peace that essentially restored the pre-war status quo. But in terms of national identity and international perception, Constitution's victories were transformative. They established the United States as a nation that could fight and win at the highest level of military technology and skill. They created a naval tradition that had not existed before, a tradition of aggressive, skillful, independent action that would define the American Navy for the next 2 centuries. And they gave the American people a symbol of national capability and determination that transcended the political divisions and regional rivalries that threatened to tear the young republic apart. It is worth pausing here to ask a question that this story naturally raises. What would have happened if Constitution had lost? What if Guerriere's cannonballs had punched through her hull the way they would have punched through any conventional frigate? What if the live oak had not held, the design had not worked, the crew had not performed? The answer is that we would be telling a very different story about the War of 1812 and about American history in general. The war was deeply unpopular in much of the country, particularly in New England, where opposition was so fierce that there was serious talk of secession. The early military disasters on the Canadian border had already shaken public confidence, and if the Navy had failed as badly as the Army initially did, the political pressure to end the war on Britain's terms might have been irresistible. Constitution's victories did not win the war. No single ship could have done that. But they bought the young nation something that was arguably even more valuable: time and confidence. They gave the American public a reason to believe that the war could be won, or at least that it could be fought with honor, and that belief sustained the national will through 2 more years of grinding conflict. In a very real sense, the live oak in Constitution's hull held together not just a ship, but a nation. The broader legacy of Joshua Humphrey's design philosophy is worth examining as well, because it influenced naval thinking far beyond the specific context of the War of 1812. The concept of a warship that deliberately breaks the established categories, too powerful for its class, too fast for its displacement, designed to control the terms of every engagement rather than simply matching the enemy on equal terms, would reappear throughout naval history in various forms. The British battlecruisers of the early 20th century, fast enough to catch any cruiser and powerful enough to destroy it, were in some sense descendants of Humphrey's logic, though they suffered from a fatal flaw that his frigates did not. Their armor was too thin for the guns they carried, as the catastrophic loss of HMS Hood in 1941 would demonstrate. The concept of the modern aircraft carrier, a vessel that projects power at ranges far beyond the reach of enemy guns, is another expression of the same principle. A platform designed not to fight on the enemy's terms, but to impose its own. Humphreys did not invent this idea in the abstract. He derived it from the specific practical problem of building a navy for a country that could not afford to build a large one. But in doing so, he articulated a strategic principle that would prove universal and enduring. Constitution's physical presence in Boston Harbor today is itself a kind of argument about the nature of memory and the obligations that the present owes to the past. She sits at Pier 1 of the Charlestown Navy Yard, a short walk from the Bunker Hill Monument, in a neighborhood that has been continuously inhabited since the colonial era. Visitors who walk her decks today, and hundreds of thousands do every year, are walking on wood that has been shaped and fitted by hands, guided by the same principles that built the original ship. The active duty sailors who serve aboard her as guides and crew members wear the uniforms of the modern Navy, but speak in the language of the age of sail, explaining the workings of a vessel that was obsolete before their great-great-great-grandparents were born. There is something deeply moving about this, a nation choosing to maintain, at considerable expense and effort, a physical connection to a moment in its history when everything was uncertain and the outcome was not assured. Constitution is not preserved because she is useful. She is preserved because she is meaningful, because the story she tells about ingenuity and courage and the refusal to accept that the established order cannot be challenged is a story that every generation needs to hear. The ship's annual turnaround cruise on the 4th of July is one of those rare public rituals that manages to be genuinely moving rather than merely ceremonial. Constitution is towed out into Boston Harbor by a modern tugboat, her crew manning the yards in the traditional fashion, her guns loaded with powder charges for the salute. At a designated point, the towline is cast off, and Constitution's crew unfurls her sails. Not all of them, but enough to catch the wind and move the ship under her own power for a brief, glorious stretch of open water. The guns fire. The crowd cheers from the shoreline and from the hundreds of small boats that gather to watch, and for a few minutes, the oldest warship in the world is sailing again, doing the thing she was built to do, her hull cutting through the same water it has been cutting through since George Washington was president. It is a moment that collapses time, that makes the distance between 1797 and the present feel not like centuries but like a single held breath, and it reminds everyone watching that the past is not dead or distant, but alive and present, sailing in the harbor, carried forward on the same wind that filled her sails when she chased down Guerriere and changed the course of history. The craftsmanship that goes into maintaining Constitution is a story of its own, one that reveals how much knowledge is embedded in the physical act of building and repairing a wooden ship. The Charlestown Navy Yard maintains a team of shipwrights and craftspeople whose skills are directly descended from the traditions of the 18th century shipbuilding trade. They work with hand tools and traditional methods when possible, shaping replacement timbers with adzes and draw knives, fitting planks with wooden pegs called tree nails, pronounced trunnels, and applying techniques of caulking, fairing, and finishing that have been passed down through chains of apprenticeship stretching back centuries. When a live oak frame needs to be replaced, the wood is sourced from the same coastal regions of the American South where the original timber was harvested, cut from trees that are themselves old enough to carry significant historical weight. The continuity is deliberate and meaningful. Each generation of craftspeople learns from the generation before it, and the ship serves as both the product and the teacher of their skills. Modern technology plays a role as well, but always in service of the original design rather than as a replacement for it. The 2015-2017 restoration used three-dimensional laser scanning to create precise digital models of Constitution's hull, allowing engineers to identify areas of deterioration that were invisible to the naked eye and to plan repairs with a precision that the original builders could never have achieved. Underwater surveys mapped the condition of the copper sheathing, still applied to the hull, still serving the same function that Paul Revere's original copper served, and identified sections that needed replacement. The combination of ancient craft and modern science has produced a vessel that is arguably in better condition now than she was at many points in her active service life. A ship that could theoretically sail across the Atlantic today if anyone wanted to send her. No one does. Of course, the risk would be unacceptable and the purpose unclear, but the fact that she could is a testament to the quality of both the original design and the ongoing care that keeps her alive. The question of what Constitution means in the 21st century is not merely academic. In an era of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and guided missile destroyers, a wooden frigate from the 1790s might seem like nothing more than a quaint relic, a museum piece maintained for sentimental reasons by a navy that has long since moved beyond anything she could contribute. But that reading misses the point entirely. Constitution's value was never purely military, even in her own time. She was always more than the sum of her guns and timbers. She was the physical embodiment of an idea. The idea that a nation too small and too poor and too new to compete by the established rules could find another way, could build something that broke the categories and changed the game. That idea did not become obsolete when steam replaced sail or when missiles replaced cannonballs. It is the same idea that drove the development of nuclear submarines, stealth aircraft, precision-guided munitions, and every other American military innovation that changed the terms of competition rather than accepting them. Constitution is the ancestor of all of that, the first and most dramatic expression of a strategic philosophy that has defined American military thinking for over 2 centuries. She is also a reminder of something that is easy to forget in an age of overwhelming American military power. There was a time when none of it existed. There was a time when the United States had no navy, no army worth the name, no military tradition, no industrial base, no standing in the world. Everything that exists today was built from nothing, by people who had no guarantee that it would work. Constitution was built in that spirit, not as a safe bet, but as a bold gamble, a wager that ingenuity could overcome raw power, and that a nation of 3 million people could build something that the greatest empire in the world could not defeat. The gamble paid off, and the ship that proved it is still floating in Boston Harbor, still carrying her guns, still flying her flag, still reminding everyone who sees her that the impossible is only impossible until someone figures out how to do it. Here is something worth thinking about the next time you stand at the edge of a harbor or look out at the open ocean. Every naval vessel you see, every aircraft carrier, every destroyer, every submarine exists because of a chain of decisions and innovations that stretches back in an unbroken line to a handful of wooden frigates, built in the 1790s by a nation that most of the world expected to fail. The design principles that Joshua Humphreys pioneered, the naval traditions that Constitution's crews established, the strategic philosophy that her victories validated, all of these are still active, still shaping the way the most powerful navy in the world thinks about itself and its mission. The ship that earned the name Old Ironsides did not just win battles. She created a legacy that is still unfolding, still evolving, still as relevant as it was on the day a British cannonball struck her hull and bounced off into the sea, and a sailor shouted that her sides were made of iron. If you ever find yourself in Boston, walk down to the Charlestown Navy Yard and step aboard her. Stand on the deck where Isaac Hull stood when he gave the order to fire. Look up at the masts that once carried enough canvas to drive 1,500 tons of wood and iron through the water at 12 knots. Put your hand on the rail and feel the wood beneath your fingers, wood that connects you through an unbroken chain of craftsmanship and care to the live oak forests of Georgia and to the men who risked their lives to cut those trees down and drag them out of the swamps. Feel the weight of 2 centuries pressing up through the planks and understand that you are standing on something that is not just history, but a living argument about what is possible when people refuse to accept that the odds are against them. If that story matters to you, and the fact that you are still here at the end of this one suggests that it does, then subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the greatest things are often built by people who had every reason to believe they could not be done.